All right, so hello everyone and welcome to the webinar, Equitable Language, Affirming People Through Language. I am Cherie Moon and I want to thank you all for being here. Before we begin the session today, I would like to just review one short thing so that you can participate better, and that is the chat feature. So the chat feature is available to you by clicking chat. It's going to allow you to post messages to everyone or to specific people, and just type your message and click chat. We do have the recording today for you guys, so that will be available shortly after this presentation. There will be a question and answer opportunity today when we are finished, so we will save all questions for that time. You can post your questions in the chat box or use the raised hand feature when that time comes. There will also be a short poll at the end of the session, and we would appreciate your participation. So today's agenda. So today we'll start by introducing our DICLC and E committee. We will look at some of the best practices and how to incorporate equitable language into our everyday lives. And we will identify steps to reach your goals of being equitable and inclusive in your language. So today's objectives. So we hope that you get a better understanding of the purpose of equitable language. We hope to improve your understanding of people first and identity first language. And we hope that you explore the equitable language resource guide and actually become able to use it in your everyday lives. I have put the links to our resources in the chat. So you should have a copy of this presentation. You should also have a copy of the resource guide. So I'm going to introduce you now to the Diversity, Inclusion, Cultural and Linguistic Competency and Equity Committee. So first we have Jacqueline Hayes of New York, Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. We have Maria Pinkleton, Georgia Council on Developmental Disabilities. Miguel Juarez, Idaho Council. Catherine Stager-Wilson, Missouri. Luz Colazo, DC Developmental Disabilities Council. McKinley Rouse, Pennsylvania Developmental Disabilities Council, and Tedra Jackson, Michigan Developmental Disabilities Council. So the purpose of the Diversity, Inclusion, Cultural Linguistics Competency and Equity Committee. So the DICLC and E, a tongue twister. So the purpose of our committee is to establish and maintain processes and resources to promote diversity, inclusion, and cultural linguistic competence in all aspects of DD Council work. We recognize and value perspectives and all the ways people differ. We try to create an environment where everyone feels safe to express themselves and are respected. So to help us continue to increase diversity efforts in our work and ensure cultural competence, we have asked members of the DD Council Network who have unique perspectives, knowledge in specific areas of practice, processes, or methods from lived experience to join our DICLC and E committee and help us think through potential problems or meet challenges in doing council work. So here I've included a few definitions of diversity, inclusion, and equity. If you would define these differently or had other ideas before you see these definitions of what diversity, inclusion, and equity meant, please drop those in the chat and we'll have a discussion about it after our presentation. So cultural and linguistic competence. They are vital components to improve outcomes, reduce disparities, promote equity by improving access for diverse populations. So the DD Act of 2000 is 23 years old. However, this definition to me reminds us to be adaptive, it's respectful and responsive to diverse populations and groups. linguistic competence. It provides readily available, culturally appropriate oral, and written language. As this definition states, as this definition states, it as well should be provided in a manner that is responsive to individuals who are receiving the services, supports, or other assistance in a manner that has the greatest likelihood of ensuring maximum participation in the programs they are involved in. And that is applicable to your council, because that's going to look different for everyone. So the equitable language document that you have received that is inside of the chat and that is posted on our itechhelp.org website. This document is adapted from the CDC's equity guiding principles for inclusive communication. It provides the background for our webinar today. So just think of this document as a glossary of terms people should consider not using, but then provides equitable choices to use that represents a shift towards non-stigmatizing language. So this is a great resource that provides the reader with the why, or an explanation of why a particular word could be offensive. Catherine, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Catherine Stager-Wilson, and I am a program coordinator with the Missouri DD Council. And my portion of the webinar, I'm just going to briefly share what equitable language is and why it's important in our work. So what is equitable language? It is respectful, accurate, and relevant to all. The words we use are powerful, and we want to be intentional with the words we choose. So our messaging is respectful, accurate, and relevant to everyone. So language is a powerful tool for enacting social and systems change. It affects our work and shapes the way we talk about our work. Research has shown that stigmatizing language can negatively impact how someone is treated. So it's important to be intentional with the language we use to address stigma within systems. In my work, I believe that our messaging and the words we use makes a tremendous difference in how people and ideas are perceived, how the disability experience and the experiences of others are perceived. And it's important that our messaging is clear and kind, reflecting our full intention and the systemic change that we want to create in our work. Next slide, please. Thank you. So let's think about why equitable language is important. Using equitable language can change the narrative. You can be intentional in your words to help avoid implicit bias. Now, sometimes people refer to implicit bias as unconscious bias, and it's pretty much the same thing. It's when we unknowingly assign stereotypes and judgments to groups of people. Biases can create and solidify disparities within our systems. So when we create documents and images, we need to practice reading our work for biases. We check our spelling and our grammar already, and so we should go back and check for bias. And you can use the guidance document that we're going to be sharing today as a tool to check for biases in our communications. And I know I plan to not only use the tool in this way, but to share it with my grantees to aid in their work as well. Also, using equitable language can make people feel more included and valued. And equitable language can lead us to perceive individuals as they are, not as a stereotype, attribute, or characteristic. Next slide, please. Thank you. So when we think about equity-centered writing, we want our messaging to be reflective of these points that are listed here on the slide. We want strength-based messaging that is positive about people and communities. We want our messaging to be respectful, accurate, relevant, and highlight inequities that people are experiencing. We want to use inclusive language that shows respect for everyone. And we want to provide an accurate view of the real world. We want to paint a picture that does not support stereotypes. And we don't want to blame groups that are marginalized, right? So people need to see and hear themselves in the language that we use in order to feel included. So it's important that the language used is relevant to the audience and to the times, because our use of language, it evolves over time and changes. And so we need to keep up to date on that. And it's important to frame inequities as problems within systems, not deficiencies within people. And then I'm gonna pass it over to Jackie.
Great, thanks so much, Catherine. I'm Jackie Hayes. I'm the Diversity and Inclusion Program Specialist at the New York DD Council and very proud member of the DICLC and E committee, and happy to be part of one of the presenters today. So I'm just going to go over a few questions to kind of consider when writing. Also, this as a guidance tool for councils and thinking about outward facing public materials. And like Catherine said, it's just so important that people are able to see themselves, and that there's respectful language and that are in especially public facing documents from government agencies or federally funded organizations. So a couple of tips, just really thinking about whose point of view is central. So if the communication focuses on a particular group or culture, are people from within that group the main actors, or really they the central actors in the publication or the document, rather than an outsider coming in as the hero? And I think just from our experience at the New York Council, really engaging with community-based organizations and reviewing materials, I think is a good practice and really helps to I think address that too, and just make sure that any sort of content that is created is really reflective of the voice and the intention of the community. Another question to think about: am I avoiding generalizations or assuming someone's identity? I think a lot of times when we talk about groups of people, there can be almost built within that this assumption that it's a whole group that looks and acts and is the same. And I think really trying to resist that in written materials is really important. I remember we had a focus group with Spanish speakers, and I just remember one parent saying, I get really frustrated when people think I'm from Mexico. Latin America is very big. There's a lot of countries, and drawing assumptions like just because I speak Spanish, I'm from this country, and so I think just again, there's a lot of diversity within racial, ethnic, linguistic groups, as well as, the LGBTQ community. And I think really just acknowledging that and, trying to avoid generalizations or assumptions about someone's identity. Does the visual content reflect the members of the audience? I think that's so important. If you think about, again, especially public information on websites or materials, really thinking about, are there pictures included? Who are in these pictures? Do they reflect the diversity of who we're serving? I think that's so important. Or, if there's a specific audience in mind, really thinking through that. So next slide. And I think, the next point is really that there's no perfect methods. A lot of this comes through engaging directly with people, getting input, and, really kind of determining what various communities prefer. And I think that happens through, again, building strong, trusting partnerships with communities. There might be some winding roads to that. And I think there's also communities who may prefer different things. Maybe there's a group that prefers the term Latinx and another group that prefers the term Latino, Latina. It's, those aren't contradictions, they're differences. And, I think it's just really important to, acknowledge that. And again, there really isn't a perfect method. It's really about meeting people where they're at and really listening to what their preferences are. Next slide. So I think, as a group, we've really discussed that a significant part of equity-centered language comes simply for taking the time to really reflect on what we're trying to get across and really being intentional with our language. And I really like that suggestion that you had, Catherine, about, we're checking for grammar. Why not check for bias and stereotypes and language with negative connotations? There has been this history, in some spaces of negative language used to refer to a lot of different groups, and really wanting to move away from that and really checking to see, are there terms that we're using that really, might perpetuate stigma or stereotypes, and how can we do that kind of check and make sure to remove anything that might have that negative connotation. Next slide. So, the tool that Cherie shared in the chat box, it's really information that's offered as a guide to council staff, to use and reflect on language that supports equity in work. Some of the language that I think is highlighted there is things that we might not want to use is found, there's a couple of terms that I think are found in the DD Act, but that document, the DD Act was published a while ago, 23 years ago. And so, language and terms and advocacy tends to evolve a lot of times faster than legislation and laws and legislation can keep up with. So I think it's important for us as DD Council staff really to keep up with the times and be listening to advocates and be on top of, the most current terms, because legislation is always going to take a second to catch up with that. So I think it's, important to, again, be in tune with advocacy efforts and keep a pace with that. So, as Catherine mentioned as well, language is a powerful tool. And now there's actually research out there that shows, that negative language referring to people in negative ways actually has health impacts, negative health impacts. And so we know that it's such a powerful tool, and especially as federally funded organizations, it's really important for us in our communication to the public and to people we serve that we're, always doing that in a respectful way. So, we're going to provide a couple of examples of, some terms that are in the guide. And, the information is really just a tool to reflect and think about how to really carefully, inclusively pick language to best, be included in public facing documents. Next slide. So here's, some examples. So you probably, heard this. I think this is fairly common. Vulnerable groups, marginalized groups, at-risk groups, hard to reach groups, targeted populations. In New York, I know we actually there's a group in New York called Hard to Reach, Hard to Serve. And that always makes me think also, like you noted, Catherine, that basically it's not the people who are hard to reach, it's the systems that have been set up poorly to address, certain communities. And so it's a systemic issue that needs to be fixed. It's a systems issue. It's not an individual or person's issue. It's the systems that really need to be changed. So, having language that reflects that, some of it is about that person first. So saying groups or communities who have been, historically excluded, or communities that are underserved. But again, I think it's really important to really, in our language, acknowledge that it's a systemic issue and not with a specific community, like it's some deficiency on their part instead of a systemic failure. All right, next slide. So again, that term, we see the term un and underserved in the DD Act. An alternative would be people who have been historically underserved, or people who have been underserved. And again, even though it's in the DD Act, we do know that there's better thinking on that. And so it's important for us to kind of embrace and I think, be ahead of and always pushing in the direction of, progressive and positive change for people with developmental disabilities. And that's why it's so important for us, I think, to always be thinking about, is there a better way that we can talk about, think about, and work with people with disabilities from, a diverse set of backgrounds to be the most representative and the most inclusive. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it to McKinley next.
Thank you, Jackie. Everyone can hear me, correct? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's McKinley
Yeah.
Rouse. I'm from the Pennsylvania Developmental Disabilities Council. I just want to talk to you about a couple of things here. First, look at the non-born person's immigration status. The commonly used terms, illegals, illegal immigrants, illegal aliens, illegal migrants, and we have the equitable alternatives, people with undocumented status, mixed status households, immigrant, migrant, asylee or asylum seeker, refugee or refugee populations, non-US born persons, foreign born persons, and non-US born persons of immigrant status. Those who are not legally citizens may be immigrants, or if it's relevant to the written piece, undocumented, not illegal or alien. Use refugee if that's what's relevant to the story. If it focuses on someone having fled violence in the home country, avoid American unless you specifically mean those with American citizenship. US residents may be more accurate. As I'm looking here, the commonly used terms are very politically charged. There's nothing positive in the term illegal, and the term alien may be dehumanizing. As I was looking at the different things, so I was saying, even as like Jackie mentioned a little bit, like what is the origin of some of these terms? Some of these dehumanizing terms or stigmatizing terms. And I think that's something that we should look at whenever we're getting our documents or preparing things, to face publicly. These terms are also frequently used when the people they are directed towards come from certain countries as opposed to others. You see illegal immigrant or illegal alien used with certain sets of countries. I won't get into those specific ones, but we kind of know what they are. And we have somebody that's maybe it's undocumented from other countries. You typically don't use those same type of terms. So that's kind of what's going on with those terms. These terms are also used to make it more difficult for some people to access needed services and supports. And that's something I've actually even seen one of my grantees deals with, that they deal a lot with immigrants and the issues that immigrants deal with, particularly immigrants who are trying to get services, with developmental disabilities and that type of thing. Next slide, please. Words with violent meanings. We have the commonly used terms, target communities for intervention, target population, tackle issues within the community, aimed at communities. And then we have our equitable alternatives, engage, prioritize, consider the needs of, tailor to the needs of, and population focus. Use of terms like target or tackle relates to our violence as a culture, I think. Again, as I was looking, I was like, wow, there's so many things that we say that have violent connotations to them. Even as I looked at the equitable language guidance document, I thought about how much violence terminology we use when we talk about addressing problems and trying to rectify them. For example, we talk about combating the school to prison pipeline. We talk about fighting against poverty. And I think that's very much part, even of just American culture. Other countries have made that comment about the United States. We tend to have a bit of a violent culture. And it's in so much of our language and so much of how we look at things. And it can even be completely unconscious. We don't even realize the violent nature of some of the things that we say. Next slide, please. Older adults, the commonly used terms, elderly, senior, frail, fragile, and the equitable alternatives. We have older adults, persons age, and we give the numeric age or people age 55 to 64. And we say elderly referring to older adults in a cultural context. Fragile and frail are particularly stigmatizing language. Ageism is a result of fearing aging. And as I did a little research on this, I found a lot of information about how ageism expresses itself in language. There's an online journal called the Gerontologist, The Language of Ages and Why We Need to Use Words Carefully. And it goes into a lot of detail about this. And the language of ageism. We look at older people as they're different. We look at they have uncharacteristic characteristics, like certain behaviors are unusual or outside the norm for people that are elderly. Like we'll make statements like, okay, that person is they're really I don't know, really with it for their age, or they're really they have a really good understanding of things for their age, or they're really strong, or they're really healthy for their age. And basically what we're saying is that things like being healthy or things like being with it that's not characteristic of a person that's elderly, and it's a type of, or a person that's older. And there's that, okay, young is better, like young is positive, old is negative type of a thing. We also say things like describing again, like old, young is good, or young is positive, old is negative. I'm like describing looking and acting young as a positive attribute, or infantilizing the elderly, like saying things like, oh, like that person is really cute, that person's adorable, when referring to somebody that's older. Next slide, please. Okay, commonly used terms for race and ethnicity. We have referring to people as their race or ethnicity, e.g., Blacks, Hispanics, Latinos, whites, American Indians, etc. Referring to people as colored people, colored Indian, referring to American Indians, Native American, Eskimo, Oriental, Afro-American, and Negro. And then we have the equitable alternatives, racial groups, American Indian or Alaskan Native persons, Asian persons, Black or African American persons, Black persons, Native Hawaiian persons, Pacific Islander persons, white persons, ethnic groups, Hispanic or Latino persons, and you have when you're describing a combination of racial and ethnic groups. Now, first of all, race is a social construct. It's actually not scientific. The term colored was used to identify segregated facilities, and that's the first thing I thought of whenever I saw it on there, colored. You had your colored water fountain, your colored bathroom, your colored entrance, and and interestingly, even like in the 90s, I remember there were some folks that I knew that they would use that term, and they were somewhat older than me, so I didn't get as offended, and they didn't even, I don't believe, meant it like to be offensive. It was just they would talk about colored folks. And so, whenever I see that word, I think of whenever I was a kid, seeing like the pictures when we did like our Black History stuff, where you would see like the colored water fountain, you'd see the colored bathroom, and that type of thing. Now, the term Caucasian also has a racist history with it. People outside the U.S. only use that term to refer to people who are from certain regions. So Caucasian does not, we think of white people, we think of Caucasian as being exactly the same thing, but people outside of the United States don't necessarily use it that way. That's actually referring to specific regions of people. But it still has its idea based in the idea of racial hierarchy. That's where that's kind of where all that comes from. Like that, the Caucasian was considered to be like the highest of the races. So you have a racial hierarchy thought process with that. There's an article called "Too Many Scientists Still Say Caucasian," and I have that in my notes and everything, and I can share that with everybody. But the article focuses on how scientific and the medical community use this term. But I think that the article has a lot to say about how it's applicable and enlightening beyond just simply the scientists and the medical personnel. It just gets into why are scientists who should know better still using this term, which was based upon racial hierarchy. An interesting idea that was pointed out in the article is that grouping is based on what the dominant culture, based more on what the dominant culture says than on ancestry, because you have similar things in other societies where you could still have like a great diversity in a particular group, but the society says, no, you are in this specific cultural group, like you're this or you're that or you're the other thing. Even though it's a great diversity that's there. And again, whatever the dominant culture says, that typically is how we look at things like racially or ethnically, and it's different in different countries. Like who's considered to be even white or Black is actually different in different countries depending on where you go. Okay, and that's it.
All right.
I'll pass it on to Les.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Luz Collazo. I'm part of the DC Council. My pronouns are she, her, and ella. On this slide, you will see equitable language on sexual orientation and gender identity. If we can say, what is sexual orientation? So sexual orientation refers to enduring emotional, romantic, and sexual attraction to another person, man, woman, or both sex. Gender identity refers to a person self-identify as a female, male, or something else. Yes, you know, sexual orientation is a continuum from exclusive attention to the other sex to exclusive attention to the same sex. Commonly used term, sexual preference, is a term considered offensive to many communities because it suggests that the person can choose and change who are attached to. Gender, binary language, sometimes used when it's not appropriate to use it. Gendered with the use word ed, past tense, is a negative word and also offensive. It's better gender because it's umbrella of form term to say gender identify or gender expression is different from the sex assigned in the birth. Also, homosexual is a word historically associated with mental illness and criminal behavior. So let's consider using the LGBT community to reflect the diversity of the community, unless a specific subgroup is a means to be referred. So equitable alternative will be lesbian, gay man, or bisexual person when referred to self-identified sexual orientation, or queer, pansexual, asexual, gender woman, when transition male from female, gender man when it's a transition from female to male, no-binary or gender queer, so one whose gender identified cannot be described as exclusively woman or man. Gender diverse, also we can refer as a gender identity or gender expression indifferent from female or male or both, or also a gender in somewhere in the continuum between male or female. Next, please. Listen and giving grace. Equitable language efforts are continually evolving alongside new research, ongoing advocacy effort. Community with your region, city, or state may have preferred language that has involved of local context. So don't be afraid to approach people you may think the wrong thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Maria?
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maria Pinkleton, and I'm the Public Relations Director at the Georgia Council on Developmental Disabilities. Just a brief visual description of me. I'm an African-American female with a fuchsia sweater, and I'm wearing red glasses. I'm going to speak a little bit about person first and identity first language, which I'm sure many of you know lots about working in the field that we work in. But just a brief description. Person first and identity first language are important distinctions to promote autonomy and support identity. As we all know, we are commonly working alongside people who have not had a lot of agency in their lives, and proper identification as to how they prefer to be identified is critical in supporting their increased agency in their lives. And also, it is an important piece in building pride in oneself. And so we really want to respect the person's choice of person first or language first language. Person first language is language that puts a person before their diagnosis, such as saying being a person with a disability. And identity first language is language that leads with a person's diagnosis, such as being a disabled person. There are many demographics of people that choose one over the other. You may know several of them. However, in the end, it is very smart just to ask what the person or the group chooses to be called. Next slide, please. So here in the state of Georgia, a few years ago, while doing our strategic 5-year planning, we did several town halls to speak to residents of Georgia that we work alongside and families that we work alongside. And one of the town halls that we did was specifically on DEI. And so we got a lot of questions from people asking, well, why is it always changing? Why do people want to be called this on one day and the next week they want to be called something else? And why is it always changing? Which can be a good question, especially if you are working in a field where you are doing creating materials, which the materials can be outdated, right? In say a year or two's time. And it can be seen as frustrating when people are saying, am I updating things correctly? Am I using the correct term now? And we found that talking to people in this space and sharing with them what you see written here kind of calms the waters a bit and lets people understand that it is ever changing, and let's be supportive of it being ever changing. The ever-changing culture and norms for how people with disabilities choose to be identified, it is best practice to assume good intent and have grace with the language others use when referring to this population. It's best to ask people what language they prefer or research the consensus of different parts of the disability community. We respect everybody's differences, and we know that as we continue to move forward towards more equitable, inclusive, and diverse spaces, our language will do the same. Next slide, please. Here are some additional steps when you are on your path to using equitable language. First and foremost, remember to try to have an open mind. Our world is ever changing, as I said before, and there is always a new normal. So be open to changing what you have always thought is normal. As Catherine said earlier, equitable language makes people feel valued, and we really want to continue doing that in all of the language that we use. And so using equitable language definitely increases their sense of value. Implicit and unconscious biases are real. So being critiqued or called out does not mean that you should defend yourself. Reflect and acknowledge that person's feelings. So also in the same vein, we want to, instead of maybe calling out, we'll call in and give people a one-on-one conversation where you discuss with them new terms that are used or terms that are no longer used, so that it is a learning opportunity, and we are very respectful of that person's feelings as they learn to be respectful of others' feelings. We want to remember to consider context. The language that is used inside of your personal environment might not be acceptable at work or outside of your community. So language that you hear others using, say a group of people that fall into one demographic, you should note that that language may be their language that they use within their own community, but it is not language that you use, say, when writing newsletters or magazine articles or white papers as a part of your professional community. Lastly, if you are unsure what words to use, just ask. Defer to people with lived experience. Consider contacting other organizations who represent a group, or you're curious about and asking questions. This could be the beginning of a great collaboration. People are generally very well accepting of those who want to know more and want to do the right thing. And so we definitely welcome you to simply ask the questions. Now I will pass it over to you, Sheree.
All right, thank you so much, Maria, and thank you to the entire DICLC and E committee. Everyone, we do recognize that some things may have been left out. So there may have been some terms left out of this presentation, and there may be some terms left out of the guidance document. But if you feel that we've made a mistake in terms, or there are terms that you think we should include, please do email me. And also the DICLC and E committee meets quarterly, and they would like to offer their assistance. So if your council would like to receive guidance from the committee, please send your questions and documents you would like them to review to me, and I will get them to the committee and we will review them and have a conversation about them and include you in on that conversation. Here is the contact information for ITAC. We have our director here, Cheryl Matney, who is actually here monitoring the chat. So please, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Again, I'm Sheree Moon, the Technical Assistance Manager. And we have a list of resources. And again, this slide has been added to the chat. So all the slides that we went over here today are in the chat along with our resource document. I am going to launch a quick poll, but I do not want that to stop you guys from having a conversation. Or Cheryl, do we have any questions in the chat?
We do. So one of the questions is, I hear the term people of color and brown people in the news often. Are there equitable alternatives? Or maybe,
Well,
maybe it could be, is people of color an appropriate term? Is brown people an appropriate term? And are there equitable? McKinley?
Well, one thing I'll say about that is that, you know, I know there are a lot of people that prefer those terms. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, I don't know how many people are familiar with Avery Brooks, the actor. Anybody know? Remember Avery Brooks? Yep. You know, Deep Space Nine, the captain, first black captain, and all that. You know, he liked to be called Brown. You know, that's his thing. He would say, you know, they would talk for him as a you know, as a black actor or black, but he would say no. He said Captain Cisco. He would say, call me Brown. And I know a lot of people that, you know, a lot of black folk like to, you know, they say people of color. That's how we refer to ourselves. So, you know, it depends. You know, and other panels they can kind of chime in as well. I mean, I don't find, you know, people of color or, you know, or brown people to be offensive. It doesn't offend me. You know what I mean? And even I was looking on the guy we had, like Afro-American. I think it was Jesse Jackson that was the one that started that. I remember that. That was like back in the 80s.
Yeah.
We're Afro-American, you know what I mean? And I remember even what do you call it? On just think about like old sitcoms, right? Like the Jeffersons, all that. Like you have, remember what was it? Lionel, like what was it? I forget who he was talking to, but it was another a black actor. And what did he say? I think he said the older fellow said, and I'm saying older. Hope I'm not. Anyway, you know, he said Negro, and I think now said black, or something. I forget what it was. You know, and then the I think it was his uncle or somebody. He said, you know, look, it took us a while to get from a certain racial epithet to this. And it took us a while to get from this to that. So he said, forgive me if it takes me a little bit of time to get to black, you know. And so my whole point of it is that even as we look at these different things, I remember how things have changed. You know what I mean? And I know, and there's still, like I said, I'm guessing if you ask Avery Brooks, he would still say call him brown. You know what I mean? As you know, as opposed to calling him black. I remember when he said, I mean, I was in TV Guide. Long story, shows how old I am. But you know, but like I said, so to me, I mean, and I get the question, right? I get the question, but you know, like I said, a lot of, you know, I mean, to me, people of color does not offend me. Although one thing I will say though is that is a more broad term, obviously, you know what I mean? So, you know, black is obviously more specific, but like I said, different people and different groups prefer different things, you know? So like I said, I mean, I'm not offended by Afro-American. I haven't heard anybody use that in a long time. I don't think Jesse Jackson meant anything negative, but I'm not quite sure why that's we got rid of that one. I don't know, but I even remember when that was a thing in the 1980s. So
I'm going to agree with you on that, McKinley. For a long time, I'll say growing up, I grew up in the 80s, and I was African American. But as I grew, I'm just Black, and I prefer to just be called Black and not African American. So it is going to be on a depends on who you're speaking with, what they like to be called. I personally do use Black and brown, and I'm not offended by people saying Black and brown people, or people of color. So anyone else in the committee, Maria?
I think it might be a regional thing also, because I know that predominantly in communities in my area, I am in Georgia, Black and brown people refers to African Americans, Indian Americans, Latin Americans, literally the shades that are more in the brown family, like the actual color when they say brown people, and not specifically people who are African American or Black. And I forget who said this prior. I agree. People of color has become more of a larger swath, meaning non-white, right? A lot of people in that demographic. So I am fine with either. There's a joke, yeah, you can call me Black or African American or whatever, just don't call me late for dinner. Yeah, I am very open, and I will respond to any of those. I'm fine with all of those. But like I said before, ask people what they like to be called. It is, always ask, they'd appreciate it.
Any other questions, Cheryl?
There were no other questions in the chat, but please feel free to raise your hands or just pop off of mute and fire away. We have our experts here for you.
So let me pose a question to the group. So, and not just the DICLC group, but to everybody. So, kind of the guidance that we have provided for you guys, do you guys think that there will be any long-term consequences of ignoring equitable language, like within your organization? So do we have to, if you don't adhere to that, do you guys see any consequences to your organization of not using equitable language? Or maybe,
are you asking the panelists too, or
yeah, everybody.
Do you mean on an internal level or?
Well, yes, for not using equitable language, or will we seem like an open organization if we're not using equitable language, like within our marketing or the things that we put out for the community? Are there?
Yeah, I mean, I could see that. I could see both an internal issue that could come up, but I could see an external issue when it comes up, because sometimes even within an organization, you may not be aware of all the equitable language, and you may say things that could be offensive to people, not be aware of it, and so I could see where there could be conflict with that. But I could also see, again, externally as well, as somebody's looking at your literature, what you're presenting, that could give them, it could drive people away. It could change their opinion about things. So I think it is important. I think there is a consequence to it.
I think we are held to a high standard to be innovative in our spaces and to be forward thinkers. And if we're not forward thinkers in this space, people will probably, we would probably lose a bit of credibility when it came to, I would say, the work that we do, if we didn't include it.
We've had a couple of people in the chat box. TJ says, council, it could limit your community engagement opportunities, or at least present you some challenges for sure. And TJ also said councils won't be as attractive for partnerships. So that forward thinking you're talking about, Maria. Melissa in North Carolina said yes, it would become a significant problem, as you guys were just speaking about, is you guys are on the forefront here. And so you're modeling, people are looking to you for that leadership and the behavior you're modeling and what you want from others. So Catherine, you started out saying, you know, you're going to share this with your grantees, which is great because you guys want to influence the way they are presenting I mean, I know it's a shared effort, but it is your work. And Charles says, pick some people off. Not inclusive is not cool. It shows you're out of touch. So that's what's in the chat, Sheree.
Thank you. And here's a two-part question for you guys. Well, before I go on, do you guys have any other questions or any other comments? So here's a two-part question. So what barriers are preventing you guys from being more inclusive or from reaching out to other groups? And what technical assistance do you need to help you reach out to other groups? So what can ITech do, or what can the DICLC and E committee provide you or help you with to help you be more inclusive? Hi,
All
Melissa.
right. I've raised my hand to try and do this in an orderly fashion. We in North Carolina, and I want to thank you folks for putting this on. And I have attended so many of these over the last couple of decades. And we've had Maria Pinkleton even come and talk to us in the last couple of years. North Carolina, even if you have the concept and you understand the concepts of the need for becoming more progressive and inclusive in terminology and you know, inviting people around the table, et cetera, it's just slow in North Carolina. We're getting the support that we need, and we're I'm sure we'll be calling upon ITAC sometime in the near future because we just love working with NACDD staff and ITAC staff at North Carolina. But North Carolina's Department of Health and Human Services is doing a wonderful job with trying to make diversity and inclusion very much of our everyday, day-to-day behavior and activities. And they've hired some folks on the state level who are very knowledgeable and well educated, et cetera, like our staff at Georgetown. Again, another area of tremendous respect for that group of folk. And we're getting what we need. North Carolina is an extremely conservative state. The North Carolina Council on Developmental Disability is equally as conservative. And we're taking steps in the right direction, but my gosh, they are small steps, and my goodness, they were slow. Maria, I think you were here in 2020. It was 2020. It's 2023, and you know, so we really are moving forward. So thank you for the offer of additional help.
Absolutely.
Sheree, we've got Asia in Arkansas said, you know, really one of the challenges is time constraints. When you have a very small staff with a very big workload, you know, that is a challenge. And she's putting forward in Arkansas, they're experiencing pushback on cultural competence from some groups and some political leaders. Because anything considered being woke can be suspect. And so this is why we're really looking at this, you know, it's very little to do with being woke. It is about being inclusive with your communication. And that is one of the foundational principles in the DD Act. I mean, we are charged with the very principle that Congress put together. And I mean, the DD Act's been around for 50 years, and inclusion has been part of the DD Act over all of these political administrations. So, you know, I know, yeah, Asia doesn't want to hear, a little education goes a long way. But I know it's sometimes people forget our history. and forget that we've been doing this for a while. This is not a new concept to DD councils. But honestly, with competing priorities, sometimes it's really good to have things brought to our attention, because I think our committee members, we have very robust discussions in meetings, and it's not that people do things purposefully. You know, there's very little malicious behavior here. It's really, as I think, Maria, you were talking about, unconscious bias. I mean, and McKinley, you referenced it. This is just, and Catherine, part of how we are, but it's the awareness and then the taking the initiative to do better. And I don't know if it's a committee member that says when you know more, or when you know better, you do better. So, Sheree?
All right, are there any other questions from our committee members? Any questions for the group or comments from our committee members before we end our presentation?
I do just have a comment or just response to time constraints and, small staff and heavy workload. I think that is a real constraint. And I think one of the things that we did in New York was just looking at, are there organizations that are set up, that are culturally competent, that are working with specific communities that you can partner with? Because I think partnerships can also be really helpful. We found in New York, we have the Office for New Americans. They've been an excellent partner for us in, I think, building relationships and doing work. I think also, I can't, New York is known as fairly progressive on these issues, but, New York is not all the same. Sometimes there are pockets of conservatism. And I think a lot of times, like in upstate New York, where it might be a little bit more conservative, if you talk about DE&I and you say rural communities are also underserved, or trying to find some entry point to build connection with saying, this is why this, work is important. It's better for everybody. And, trying to think of some, just a way that really is like a hook to get a little bit more buy-in from people that might not historically be thought of as allies.
Awesome, thank you, Jackie. Are there any other councils here that have that same issue with, or that same barrier with reaching other groups that want to make a comment? All right, well, I want to thank the DICLC committee for your wonderful presentation. And I want to thank you all again for joining us. If you have not taken our poll, please do so. We really need your feedback. And have a great Thursday. Thank you all so very much for being here.